Abraham Lincoln once wrote, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is not democracy. Our next speaker's books, in some form or fashion, take their bearings from this sentiment of Lincoln's. I'll mention just two of our speaker's books. The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and the Triumph of Anti-Slavery Politics, is the book I had intended to write. He beat me to it and won the Lincoln Prize to boot. Second book, published just in time to coincide with this year's sesquicentennial of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, is entitled Freedom National: The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861 to 1865. It also won the Lincoln Prize, which makes two more than I have. Let me make just one comment about this important book. In chapter 12, the last formal chapter of the book, his account of the debate over the passage of the 13th Amendment demonstrates that the actual historical record can be as riveting as any cinematic portrayal that Kushner and Spielberg can dream up. Now to our speaker. James Oakes is a distinguished professor of history and graduate school humanities professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Today he will speak on the Emancipation Proclamation, Myths and Realities. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Oakes.
Thank you, Lucas. That was an unexpected pleasure. Thank you to the National Archives, to David Ferriero and Susan Clifton, in particular to Michael Burlingame for extending this invitation. The last time I spoke here, I finished my talk, and the first hand that went up was Michael's. Michael had just published his Green Monster, as he calls it, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm about to be asked a question by the world's leading Abraham Lincoln biographer. So keep your hand down. There was great excitement among the slaves on Charles Hayes's plantation, 16 miles from Louisville, when they heard the news that Abraham Lincoln had issued an Emancipation Proclamation a few days before. It was early January of 1863, and a number of Union men passing by Hayes's plantation, quote, inquired of the slaves if their master had set them free. Fearing he would be arrested if he failed to let his slaves know of their freedom, Hayes appeared one morning as the slaves were eating their breakfast. In a nervous, uneasy manner, he made the announcement. Men and women, hear me. I am about to tell you something I never expected to be obliged to tell you in all of my life, and it is this. It becomes my duty to inform you, one and all, women, men, and children belonging to me, you are free to go where you please. Hayes then cursed Lincoln, quote, for taking all you Negroes away from me. A great jubilee commenced on the plantation, but Old Massa got drunk and skulked off to his room while the slaves were, quote, cheering Abraham Lincoln. Bless the Lord, Aunt Bess exclaimed, my children are all free. It's an interesting story in its own right, and it helps us appreciate one of the many ways the slaves were freed during the Civil War. But I want to make a different point about the story, and it is this. If you ever hear someone say that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free a single slave, think of Charles Hayes cursing Abraham Lincoln back in January of 1863. But let's move ahead to March 29, 1864, and listen to a different kind of speech. This one given by Senator Lyman Trumbull as he reported the 13th Amendment, the one abolishing slavery, out of his Judiciary Committee. Why do we need such an amendment? Trumbull asked. Because the Emancipation Proclamation was not enough, he answered. Trumbull cited the critics who claimed that at best Lincoln's proclamation had applied only to slaves who were actually physically freed during the war, like the slaves on Charles Hayes's plantation. Trumbull wasn't sure the critics were right, but he could not be sure they were wrong either. This was a serious problem because most slaves in the Confederate States were not, as Lincoln put it, practically freed, that is, in practice, freed during the war. And when the war ended, emancipation would stop. And what about the slaves of loyal masters in the loyal slave states? The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free them either, Trumbull pointed out. And even if Lincoln's proclamation had freed them, Trumbull admitted, what was to stop the southern states from re-enslaving them when the war was over? Freedom was national, Republicans believed, whereas slavery was merely local. It was a state institution. And when the peace was restored, the power over slavery would revert to the states. For all of those reasons and more, Trumbull argued, we must have a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. Trumbull's speech lacks the human drama of Charles Hayes's announcement of emancipation to his slaves, but it suggests an equally important lesson. When you hear someone say that in affixing his signature to the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln freed all the slaves, quote, with the stroke of his pen, think of Senator Lyman Trumbull, desperately imploring his colleagues to pass the 13th Amendment, because if they didn't, the war would end without slavery having been abolished in most of the South. We oversimplify the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't free a single slave. It freed all the slaves. We shroud the document in myths. We conjure up myths about Abraham Lincoln to explain our myths about his proclamation. He was a reluctant emancipator. That's why he didn't free a single slave. He was the great emancipator who freed all the slaves. And all of this mythology was as popular back then as it is today. It was already in place, publicly debated, even before Lincoln issued the proclamation. We are blinded by these myths. We always have been, so much so that even now, 150 years later, we cannot answer the simplest but most important question: what did the Emancipation Proclamation actually do? The mythology of the proclamation had a lot to do with its timing. Lincoln issued it on January 1st, 1863, 20 months after the war had started, nearly 20 months, thereby raising the question, what took him so long? In the summer of 1862, when people first tried to answer that question, they usually resorted to idle speculations. They drew inferences based on ignorance about what Lincoln was up to. And it didn't take long for those speculations and inferences to harden into myth, or rather into two myths, one of them pro-Lincoln and the other anti-Lincoln. Horace Greeley may be taken as the spokesman for, if not the godfather, of the anti-Lincoln myth. Greeley was the opinionated editor of the New York Tribune, one of the most influential papers in the United States. In August of 1862, Greeley published a famous editorial called The Prayer of 20 Millions. The 20 million referred to the number of people living in the northern states, and what they were all praying for, according to Greeley, was emancipation. Greeley demanded that the president enforce the law, specifically the emancipation provisions of the Second Confiscation Act that Lincoln had signed a month earlier on July 17, 1862. Those provisions would not take full effect until the president issued a proclamation. Everyone assumed that Lincoln would issue it shortly after he signed the bill, but he didn't, and after 3 or 4 weeks, Greeley was losing his patience. Why the delay, he asked. And in his answer, he concocted one of those enduring myths that I mentioned earlier. Lincoln was taking so long, Greeley wrote, because in his heart of hearts, Lincoln didn't really want to free the slaves. From the start of the war, Lincoln had resisted every effort to undermine slavery. Look at the record, Greeley urged. Lincoln came into office in March of 1861, vowing not to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. In September, he overturned the proclamation issued by General John C. Fremont that would have freed the slaves of all the rebels in Missouri. In May of 1862, Lincoln overturned another order, General David Hunter's edict abolishing slavery in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. A few months later, Lincoln nearly threw the national government into a crisis by threatening to veto the Second Confiscation Act, the very law that would free slaves as soon as Lincoln issued his proclamation. And now, a month later, the nation sits and waits for Lincoln to implement the statute he never liked to begin with. In Greeley's telling, Lincoln was a most reluctant emancipator. He took so long to issue the Emancipation Proclamation because he never wanted to issue it, and when he finally did issue it, Lincoln did so not for lofty moral reasons, not because slavery was wrong, but because the destruction of slavery had become what Lincoln called a military necessity. To this day, skeptics recite the same litany that Greeley did, use the same reasoning, and come to the same conclusion. It took 20 months to issue the proclamation because Lincoln was reluctant to make emancipation a legitimate goal of the war, and finally did so only to deprive the rebels of their slaves in order to win the war. 1 month after Greeley published his Prayer of 20 Millions, Lincoln issued on September 22, 1862, a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation announcing his intention to free the slaves 100 days later. This preliminary proclamation provoked a rush of commentary, including a remarkable essay in the Atlantic Monthly magazine written by none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famed transcendentalist. Emerson's essay can be read as a response to Horace Greeley's Prayer of 20 Millions, an alternative explanation for the timing of Lincoln's proclamation, except that Emerson's explanation for the delay reflected glory rather than disgrace upon Lincoln. Where Greeley gave us the myth of the reluctant emancipator, Emerson gave us the myth of the great emancipator. Liberty is a slow fruit, Emerson began. He was laying the foundation for an explanation of why it took Lincoln so long to issue his proclamation. It takes time for the fruit of liberty to ripen. The public was not yet ready, Emerson explained. The audience for the proclamation had to be created, an audience hitherto passive and unconcerned, now at last so scorched and kindled that they came forward. When the war began, Emerson suggested, public indifference to slavery was so ingrained, hostility to emancipation so deep, that Lincoln had to wait to educate the people up to the justice of the cause before he could act. And so Lincoln waited with infinite patience until the, quote, public sentiment of the country was at last unmistakably pronounced. When we consider the immense opposition to emancipation that Lincoln faced, Emerson declared, quote, one can hardly say the deliberation took too long. Instead, quote, against all timorous counsels, Lincoln had the courage to seize the moment. This was greatness, and since it's Emerson talking, we might as well call it transcendental greatness. Lincoln was so fair-minded, so patient, and yet so modest that we can only marvel at the, quote, capacity and virtue which divine providence has made an instrument of benefit so vast. As God's chosen instrument, Lincoln had no choice but to issue his proclamation. He was put here at this time and in this place to do what had to be done. It was his destiny. Lincoln, Emerson wrote, quote, has been permitted to do more for America than any other American man. And just what had Lincoln done? He removed the blot of slavery from our national honor, lifted the heavy load of the national heart. He freed the slaves, but he also redeemed the nation. So we have two competing explanations for the delayed timing of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and as I've indicated, both of them were more or less fully formed before the proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. Greeley's Lincoln was the reluctant emancipator. Emerson's was the great emancipator. Greeley claimed to speak for 20 million Northerners who were waiting anxiously for Lincoln to finally issue the proclamation. Emerson's Lincoln was faced with immense popular opposition to emancipation. He waited patiently for public opinion to come around to his more advanced views. They can't both be right, but they can both be wrong. Both Greeley and Emerson were blinded by the false premise of the question they were asking, what took Lincoln so long? That question assumes that emancipation would not begin until Lincoln issued the proclamation. But the fact is that the Lincoln administration had begun formally emancipating slaves more than a year earlier, on August 8, 1861. There was no 20-month delay requiring any explanation. Lincoln was neither reluctant to emancipate slaves, nor was he waiting patiently for public opinion to catch up with him. By the time he issued the proclamation, the Union had been freeing slaves for almost a year and a half, tens of thousands of slaves. So the mythology of the Emancipation Proclamation is doubly misleading. It's not merely that the Greeley and Emerson explanations for Lincoln's timing were wrong, it's that they both assumed that there had been no emancipation until Lincoln finally, at long last, proclaimed it. The myth erased the history. All of the emancipations prior to January 1st, 1863 have simply disappeared from our historical memory. And until we recover that history, until we understand why the slaves were emancipated before the Emancipation Proclamation, we can't possibly understand what the proclamation actually did, or, to be more precise, what the proclamation changed. In the mythic account, emancipation begins with Lincoln's long-awaited proclamation. In the historical account, it begins much earlier, in the spring of 1861, 6 weeks after the war began. On May 30th, Lincoln met with his cabinet to discuss the request by General Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe in Virginia that he be allowed to withhold runaway slaves from their owners. 3 slaves had escaped to his lines asking for asylum, and when their owners showed up demanding their fugitives be returned, Butler refused. He called them contraband of war. He sent 2 urgent letters to Washington, one on May 27th, the second on May 28th, asking whether what he had done was the right thing. The cabinet met to discuss Butler's request 2 days later, on May 30th, and when the meeting was over, the War Department telegraphed the general at Fortress Monroe not only approving his contraband policy, but authorizing Butler to refuse to return any runaway slaves who came within his lines. There's the first move. Barely 6 weeks after Fort Sumter, the Lincoln administration stopped enforcing the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution for any slaves coming within Union lines from a seceded state. But it wasn't emancipation. Butler was authorized to retain fugitives, but he was not authorized to free them. Only Congress could determine the status of the fugitives, and that's what Congress proceeded very quickly to do. Shortly after the attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called Congress to come back to Washington for an emergency session 5 months ahead of schedule, beginning on July 4th, 1861. Less than 3 weeks later, on July 20th, Senator Lyman Trumbull reported a confiscation bill to the floor and immediately attached an amendment that would emancipate the slaves of emancipate any slaves used by the Confederates in support of the rebellion. Trumbull's Emancipation Amendment became Section 4 of the First Confiscation Act, endorsed by nearly every Republican in Congress and signed into law by President Lincoln on August 6, 1861. Under the terms of the Confiscation Act, emancipation would be a 2-step process. First, Congress decreed that masters would forfeit the services of any slaves used in the rebellion. Then the president would emancipate the forfeited slaves by virtue of his authority as commander-in-chief, thus giving emancipation the requisite military character the Constitution required. And so, on August 8, 1861, 2 days after he signed the bill into law, Lincoln's War Department issued the instructions for implementing it. Rebel masters would forfeit the service of any slaves used in support of the rebellion, and those slaves were, quote, discharged from service permanently, which is to say they were emancipated. But there was more. The House of Representatives had also endorsed a resolution declaring that Union soldiers were not supposed to participate in any way in the capture or return of fugitive slaves. So we have a law that says all slaves coming into Union lines who were used in rebellion are to be emancipated, and a congressional resolution stating that the Union Army cannot participate in the return of fugitive slaves. What does the War Department do to implement these 2 policies? It authorizes Butler to emancipate all slaves who come within Union lines in any area, from any area in rebellion. The August 8th instructions were sent that day to Fortress Monroe, where there were by then 900 contrabands, all of whom were immediately freed. And that was only the beginning. In September, a copy of the August 8th instructions were sent to General John Dix in Maryland, ordering him to emancipate any slaves escaping into his lines from the seceded state of Virginia. In November, the August 8th instructions were given to the commander of the Joint Army-Navy operation that established a Union beachhead at Port Royal on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and the 9,000 slaves on those islands were immediately emancipated. In December, the Adjutant General of the War Department ordered General Henry Halleck to emancipate any slaves fleeing into the loyal state of Kentucky from the seceded state of Tennessee. And in his first annual message to Congress that same month, December of 1861, President Lincoln noted that under the terms of the First Confiscation Act, numerous slaves had escaped into Union lines where they were, quote, thus liberated. Emancipation accelerated over the course of 1862. In February, General Ambrose Burnside captured New Bern, North Carolina, whereupon he freed the slaves. In April, when General David Hunter captured Fort Pulaski and Cockspur Island and several of the surrounding islands off the coast of Georgia, he freed the slaves, for he too had been given a copy of the August 8th instructions from the War Department. And in June, when General George McClellan led his immense Army of the Potomac up the peninsula headed toward Richmond, he followed the same orders. All slaves who came within his lines were emancipated. Loyal masters might someday be compensated, McClellan explained, but their slaves were immediately and permanently freed. By the spring of 1862, thousands of slaves all along the southern Atlantic coast, from Hampton Roads in Virginia to Fernandina, Florida, had been emancipated under the War Department's August 8th instructions implementing the First Confiscation Act. Emancipation began on August 8, 1861, not January 1, 1863. Once we understand what the First Confiscation Act actually did, the reluctant emancipator thesis begins to collapse. Consider Lincoln's famous revocation of General Fremont's order emancipating slaves of all rebels in Missouri. Lincoln did not tell the general that he could not free slaves. What he told Fremont to do was rewrite his order to conform to the First Confiscation Act. Fremont's original order was illegal. Rather than emancipate slaves in areas over which Fremont had no control, Lincoln ordered the general to emancipate rebel-owned slaves coming within his lines as the law required. Lincoln subsequently revoked General Hunter's order for the same reason. Actually, Hunter had issued two orders. The first one freed all the slaves who came within his lines from the area around Fort Pulaski that he occupied. That order was legal and nobody revoked it. Then Hunter issued a second order abolishing slavery in 3 entire states, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. That order was clearly illegal and Lincoln revoked it. In short, Lincoln never told either Hunter or Fremont that they could not emancipate slaves. On August 24, 1862, the Union Navy, commanded by David Farragut, broke through the Confederate defenses of the lower Mississippi River, capturing New Orleans and with it the heavily populated slave plantation parishes of southern Louisiana. Transferred from Virginia, our old friend Benjamin Butler took control of the area, but he was not sure whether the tens of thousands of slaves in southern Louisiana met the criteria for emancipation established by the First Confiscation Act or the August 8th War Department instructions. Unlike the Sea Islands and Fortress Monroe, the Louisiana slaveholders did not all flee from their plantations, and it was unclear whether the slaves on those plantations actually came within Union lines as the law required. Were those slaves emancipated, Butler asked his superiors in Washington? Congress answered his question with a second Confiscation Act, which Lincoln signed into law on July 17, 1862. It declared that in Union-occupied areas of the South, areas that were formerly occupied by the Confederates, that is, areas like southern Louisiana, slaves owned by anyone who could not demonstrate, quote, continuous loyalty to the Union were immediately emancipated. Right away, Lincoln sent word to Butler to implement the new rules. Quote, by the act of Congress, Butler began telling his subordinates, they are clearly free, end quote. This was the summer of 1862, 6 months before Lincoln issued his proclamation. Horace Greeley was publishing pious editorials wondering why it was taking Lincoln so long to free the slaves, and all the while Lincoln was ordering the emancipation of thousands of slaves in the lower Mississippi Valley. Further up the Mississippi River, Generals Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were even more hesitant about emancipation than Butler was. But at first they implemented the Second Confiscation Act only to the extent of allowing slaves into their lines and putting them to work for the Union Army. But they did not assume that the slaves had been emancipated. Lincoln's preliminary proclamation set them straight. It quoted extensively from the provisions of the Second Confiscation Act that freed all rebel-owned slaves in Union-occupied areas of the South, which encompassed the areas under the control of Generals Grant and Sherman. Within days, the War Department printed 15,000 copies of Lincoln's preliminary proclamation and distributed them through the Army as General Orders 109. Grant and Sherman got the point. Quote, "They are free," Sherman finally admitted in the fall of 1862. Quote, "The President declares the Negroes free." Grant agreed. In November, he assigned Chaplain John Eaton to oversee the transition to free labor among the newly emancipated slaves in the areas under his control, the heavily populated plantation districts along the Mississippi River north of Vicksburg. During those same months, in late 1862, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton instructed generals in Arkansas to begin emancipating slaves who came within their lines. Now listen one more time to the way political and military officials were talking about slavery in the year before the Emancipation Proclamation. Listen to Abraham Lincoln explaining to Congress in late 1861 that numerous slaves had been coming into Union lines and were, quote, "thus liberated." To Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase, replying to a Sea Island planter who asked about the status of his slaves, quote, "They are free," Chase told him. To General Sherman, making the same declaration later in 1862, "They are free. The President declares the Negroes free." And to General Benjamin Butler, explaining to his officers in Louisiana that, quote, "By the act of Congress, they are clearly free." All of these emancipations were initiated by the Lincoln administration, implementing congressional statutes before the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. Which brings us back to the question of the hour: what did the Emancipation Proclamation actually do? If the federal government had been freeing slaves for nearly a year and a half, if tens of thousands had already been emancipated, what changed after Lincoln issued the proclamation? Legally, of course, the proclamation implemented the policy adopted by the Republicans in the Second Confiscation Act, which made emancipation universal in the seceded states. The Union had been freeing slaves in areas it occupied. Now it would free slaves in the unoccupied areas of the rebellious states. And Section 6 of the law required a presidential proclamation to be implemented. And that's what the Emancipation Proclamation technically did. But how? How could the president effectively emancipate slaves in areas over which the Union Army had no control? He would do so by changing military policy on the ground in two distinct ways, one of them well known, the other almost completely unknown. First, Lincoln's proclamation authorized the systematic enlistment of blacks into the Union Army. Everyone knew that for the slaves to be freed, the Union had to win the war. If the Confederacy succeeded in establishing its independence, slavery would go on forever. Black soldiers would help prevent this. In the struggle to suppress the Southern Rebellion, Lincoln said, black troops did double duty. Every slave recruited into the Union Army deprived the Confederacy of his labor and added that same amount of labor to the strength of the North. Lincoln eventually concluded that black soldiers were indispensable to Union victory in the war, which meant they were indispensable to the destruction of slavery. That's one of the reasons it made sense for Lincoln to put the announcement of black soldiers into the Emancipation Proclamation. But there was another reason as well. Lincoln and the Republicans believed that that service to the Union Army ensured that a soldier who had been a slave could never be re-enslaved. Remember Trumbull's warning. Nobody could be absolutely certain that slaves freed during the war were in fact freed forever. But most Northerners were sure that you could never revoke the freedom of a former slave who risked his life for his country by enlisting in the Union Army. Enlistment guaranteed emancipation. And this is one of the reasons black enlistments were highest in the states that were technically exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation, states like Tennessee and Kentucky. For slaves in those states, enlistment was the surest path to irrevocable freedom during the Civil War. We know a great deal about the history of black soldiers during the Civil War, but we know almost nothing about enticement, the second major policy shift instituted by the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, we know so little about enticement that I'd be willing to wager that hardly anybody in this room, except for those who've read my book, knows what it means to say that the Emancipation Proclamation lifted the ban on enticement. You might be able to guess, but I'd be surprised if any of you really know. What did it mean to lift the ban on enticement? To answer that question, that question, we have to understand something else about Union emancipation policy before the proclamation. So let's go back one last time to Fortress Monroe and take a closer look at precisely what Lincoln's cabinet authorized General Benjamin Butler to do back in May of 1861. In his May 30th telegram to Butler, shortly after the cabinet meeting adjourned, the Secretary of War instructed the general to keep all contrabands who came within Union lines, but otherwise to leave the peaceful operation of slavery alone. That same distinction was repeated in the August 8th instructions for implementing the First Confiscation Act. Union soldiers were authorized to emancipate all slaves coming into their lines, but they were forbidden to entice slaves away from their masters. Over the course of the next year and a half, Union authorities maintained that same basic distinction. As John Hay, one of Lincoln's secretaries, put it in September of 1862, the government's policy was, quote, not to return to slavery those slaves who fall necessarily into our hands in the course of the war, but Union soldiers were, quote, not to entice them in, nor to incite them to rise. On December 17, 1862, 2 weeks before the proclamation, General Grant ordered his superintendent of contrabands to employ, quote, any Negroes who voluntarily come within the lines of the Army, but in no case, Grant added, quote, will Negroes be forced into the service of the government or be enticed away from their homes unless it becomes a military necessity. That was the ban on enticement, the ban that was lifted by the Emancipation Proclamation. John Nicolay, Lincoln's other secretary, explained the new policy on January 2nd, 1863, the day after the proclamation. Henceforth, Nicolay said, the slave population will be used to suppress the rebellion, quote, as rapidly as it can be brought within Union lines. It is the policy of this government, General-in-Chief Henry Halleck explained to Grant in March, quote, to withdraw from the enemy as much productive labor as possible. Union troops must never discourage Negroes from coming under our protection. This is not only bad policy in itself, Halleck explained, quote, but is directly opposed to the policy adopted by the government. The character of the war has changed, Halleck added. The policy now adopted by the government is to, quote, withdraw from the use of the enemy all the slaves you can. The War Department's Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas likewise explained the new policy in the spring of 1862, quote, they are to be encouraged to come within our lines. Lorenzo Thomas was the most well-known and influential Union officer engaged in the systematic enticement of slaves, but there were others operating in many parts of the Confederacy, and by the end of the war, the Union Army had assigned 237 soldiers to duty as emancipation agents whose sole purpose was to go on to farms and plantations and encourage slaves to leave their owners. James Ayres was one of those agents, and his remarkable diary gives us a vivid account of just how enticement worked on the ground. I'm going to quote extensively from Ayres' diary, but I need to warn you in advance that although Ayres was a minister and a devoted abolitionist who hated slavery, he was a 19th century man who used 19th century language, much of which is offensive to us. But to censor his words would destroy the effect of his diary. Here's his entry for May 7th, 1864. On that day, Ayres rode onto a plantation 10 miles outside of Huntsville, Alabama, and into a field where 27 slaves were gathering corn. Whose farm is this? Ayres asked. Master Eldridge's, sir. Is that his house yonder? Yes, massa. Is he good to you? Not mighty good, massa. Is he a Union man or a secessionist? After telling Ayres that their master, quote, swears and cusses at the Yanks terribly, the slaves went back to their work, lest their master, quote, flog us if he sees us idle and whip us for talking to you, end quote. Ayres reassured them. I have come to tell you good news, he said. Father Abraham has declared you all free. You have no master now. You are free, and I have come to tell you. Getting down from his horse, Ayres began to read from a card announcing that, quote, all slaves were made free men by Abraham Lincoln, and urging able-bodied colored men to come to the nearest Union camp to, quote, fight for the Stars and Stripes. Ayres made his pitch. The Army would pay $10 a month plus food and clothing and, quote, make you free if you will enlist and be soldiers. "How many of you boys will turn out?" Ayres asked. "When do you want us?" "Want you right now." "Oh, master won't let us go." "Never mind your master," Ayres said. "You have none." Ayres then rode up to the house where he understood there were more potential recruits, and there he met the Eldridge family, quote, "Master, Mrs., and the gals." "How do you do?" Ayres said. "Fine day this is." "Yes," Mr. Eldridge answered. "What's all this mean? My niggers say you've come into the field to set them all free. Is that so?" "Yes, sir." "Well, I'd like to know how you got the authority to do so, sir." "By the War Department, sir, I get my authority, the very best authority, ain't it?" "What do you want with my niggers?" Eldridge demanded. "Your niggers," Ayres replied. "You've got no niggers, my dear sir. These are all free men, as you or I am, and these women here that have been your slaves are all free now, so much as this lady." Eldridge then invited Ayres to leave, but the Union recruiter was hardly finished. "Leave?" Ayres said. "Why, sir, I will leave when I get ready, but I'm going to take your men, or these men, when I go. You may bet your eyes on that." Ayres then drew his revolver and continued his lecture. "Mister," one of Eldridge's daughters interrupted, "are you going to take Dad's niggers away from him, whether or not they're willing to go?" "Well, no, ma'am, I ain't," Ayres replied, "but I'll tell you what I am going to do." In his experience, Ayres explained, he had found it best to walk off with the young black men a half-mile or so and, quote, "have a big talk with them to see if he could persuade them to enlist in the Union Army. Those he, quote, can't coax would be free to go back." Eldridge's daughter next suggested that Ayres allow her father to speak with the men before they walked off, but Ayres thought that was not a very good idea. He had his solitary chat with the men, and when he left, he had 6 black recruits with him. Shortly thereafter, they enlisted in the 15th Tennessee Colored Regiment based in Nashville. So that's how enticement worked, on a small but fascinating scale, but it also worked on a large scale. Beginning in the spring and summer of 1863, as the enticement policy was systematically implemented, we start to see those truly large numbers of contrabands coming into the Union lines, particularly in the Western armies. During the Meridian Campaign, for example, Sherman's troops were said to be trailing 4,000 or 5,000 contrabands in their wake. He had another 10,000 freed people with him during the famous March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah, and 7,000 more followed his troops as they marched through the Carolinas. This was military emancipation at high tide, the logical conclusion of a policy of enticement implemented by the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. But it wasn't enough to destroy slavery. In the year after Lincoln issued his proclamation, it became increasingly clear to the President and congressional Republicans that no matter how aggressively the Union Army enforced military emancipation in the South, it could never physically free more than a fraction of the slaves. Think of James Ayres. He had walked onto a plantation with 27,000 slaves and walked off with 6 of them. 21 slaves remained, and no one could be sure that when the war ended, they had been legally emancipated, no matter what Lincoln or Ayres told them. Or think of General Sherman. There were 10,000 freed people with him on his march from Atlanta to Savannah, but in 1860, there were 463,000 slaves in Georgia. Lincoln was certain that all the slaves actually freed during the war could never be returned to slavery, but he also came to realize that when the war ended, most of the slaves would not have been actually, practically freed. Lincoln could not have been surprised by this, for no one had been more skeptical of the Emancipation Proclamation than he had been. On at least 3 occasions in the months before he issued it, Lincoln expressed serious doubts that a presidential proclamation would do any good. "I can't enforce the law in the rebel states as it is," Lincoln would say. "What makes you think I could enforce an Emancipation Proclamation in those same states? It would be," he said, like, quote, "the papal bull against the comet." And yet, on January 1st, 1863, he issued it, and having done so, he drastically altered Union military policy on the ground in the South in an effort to make it work. But it still wasn't enough to ensure the complete destruction of slavery, and by 1864, Lincoln and the Republicans understood that, which is why they pushed so strongly for the 13th Amendment. The Democrats by defeating the amendment in the House in June of 1864, just as that year's presidential election was gearing up, turned the campaign into a referendum not only on war but also on abolition. Everyone understood that if Lincoln lost, there would be no amendment, and the war would end with Northern victory, but without abolition. And when he was reelected in November, Lincoln invested all the political capital his victory earned him in getting the amendment through Congress. I've always been skeptical of the mythology of shrouding the proclamation. Lincoln did not free all the slaves with the stroke of his pen. He did not wait patiently for public opinion to catch up with his advanced views. He did not bestride his times and lead his benighted people out of the darkness. And he was not the only man in America responsible for the destruction of slavery. But he was the only indispensable man. It's ironic, isn't it, that someone as temperamentally conservative as Abraham Lincoln would end up leading the most revolutionary social upheaval in American history? But as a friend of mine once said to me, conservatives often make the best radicals. They keep their revolutions from sliding into terror and anarchy. Of course, when I say Lincoln and the Republicans were revolutionaries, I don't mean that they were socialists or communists or anarchists. They were never going to smash wage labor or redistribute the land, nor had they set out to abolish the various forms of discrimination that flourished in the United States of their day. They did not believe in racial or social or sexual equality as we commonly understand those things in the 21st century. Yet in their own time, and in their own way, Lincoln and the Republicans were genuine radicals, 19th century radicals, exemplars of that impressive wave of bourgeois revolutions that spread across the Atlantic world beginning in 1776. We Americans are so thoroughly the products of those revolutions. We have so completely absorbed their precepts that we no longer appreciate how their explosive their implications were. The Civil War reminds us of their power. Abraham Lincoln believed that all men were equally entitled to their basic freedom, that all Americans of whatever color were entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship. He thought it was unnatural for one human being to hold property rights in another human being, and that it was immoral for a master to claim the fruits of a slave's labor. And so he hated slavery. In language that was for him uncharacteristically harsh, Lincoln declared that he had always hated slavery, hated it for as long as he could remember, hated it, he said, as much as any abolitionist. Here was the driving passion that, for all of Lincoln's temperamental conservatism, sustained him and his fellow Republicans through the great liberal revolution we call the Civil War. As in so many revolutions, the radical impulse, once unleashed, gathered force with each passing month. Lincoln moved with that revolutionary tide, sometimes taking the lead, never looking back. If that didn't make him the great emancipator, it surely made him our greatest president. Thank you. We have some time. I can take some questions.
Yes,
but not from you.
Okay. You all remember the drill. There are microphones on the side aisles, so those of you who have questions or comments, please step forward, and if you don't, I will.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
I've got a question concerning the Arnold bill that was passed in June of '62.
Yes.
Now, in '57, Tawney declares in Dred Scott that Congress cannot prohibit slavery in the territories.
Yes.
In June of '62, the Isaac Arnold bill prohibits slavery in the territories.
Yes.
Your book got me interested in going back to the debates. I read the debates in the Congressional Globe at the time.
Right.
Nowhere does any member in the House or Senate recognize that contradiction. Now,
Right.
what was going on at that point in terms of the party's rationale? Were the Republicans agreeing with Lincoln that the Tawney prohibition was dicta, not legally binding, or were they just basically saying, to heck with Roger
Right.
Tawney at this point, we're doing what we want to do?
Right. Well, the first thing I want to say is I defer to a very good constitutional historian named Michael S. Benedict, who has written exactly on this question. The person in Congress who actually explains this best is Charles Sumner. They live in a constitutional universe fundamentally different from the one we live in. The idea that the Supreme Court was not just the final arbiter, but the only ultimate arbiter of what was and was not constitutional was not universally accepted at that point. Right? The Supreme Court could declare a law unconstitutional, but Congress could disagree and say, I'm sorry, we think it is constitutional. And I think that's what's basically going on there. They don't yet live in a world where if the Supreme Court says it, that's it. It's finished forever. So it's not simply that they say it's dicta. Some of them, they all do say that. But they'll also say things like the Supreme Court issued a disgraceful decision and we don't have to abide by it. And we think it was constitutional. And there isn't anything actually, whether the Constitution doesn't say that the Supreme Court has the final word on what is or is not constitutional. The idea of judicial review takes a long time to evolve, and it really isn't until the middle of the 20th century that we get this consensus that the Supreme Court says it's over. But I will say, I was also shocked by that. And it took me a while to figure it out as well. It is kind of shocking when you see it because it's so alien to us. So,
It's a little long-winded, for which I apologize, but prior to your book, there's been sort of a view of the abolition of slavery. It goes roughly like this. There were muddled attempts during the Civil War to address the issue of slavery until January 1st, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln hurls this lightning bolt called the Emancipation Proclamation, which incinerates the charnel house of slavery, and then the 13th Amendment comes along to mop up the debris.
Exactly.
Now comes your book, which
that wasn't long-winded at all.
now comes your book, which I'll summarize as, no, it's just just one more nail in the coffin of slavery, a big nail to be sure, but just a nail. But I'm wondering why Abraham Lincoln thought it was such a big deal. When he signs it, he says, of course, if my name ever goes down in history, it'll be for this act. And before that, I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right. And for that matter, the abolitionists on January 1st held a great big party in Boston. I'm sure it wasn't because, oh, wow, we can now entice the slaves.
Well, I hope I did not give the impression in my book that I don't think the Emancipation Proclamation is important. I have a whole chapter on the Emancipation. I have an entire chapter on the preliminary proclamation and another chapter on the Emancipation. I think that there's a shift over the course of 1862 that's absolutely crucial to understanding the war, and that is the shift to the idea that every slave has to be freed in order to destroy this rebellion. And that's the Emancipation Proclamation is the moment when that policy is implemented. It's not the first time anybody thought about it. It's sort of there in the Second Confiscation Act, but it really does transform the nature of the war from that moment on. And then there's something else. I didn't mention it in my talk, but because it's something I wanted to spend a lot more time on and didn't have enough time to do. But I also think that it made the 13th Amendment possible. Because nobody imagined a 13th Amendment before the war. No abolitionist proposed the 13th Amendment before the Civil War going in. And I don't think the idea of absolutely, completely abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States was imaginable until the Emancipation Proclamation made it imaginable, and that cleared the kind of political ground. It created what I call the political will for a 13th Amendment so that when the Republicans adopt it in 1864, Northerners are already accustomed to the idea of universal emancipation anyway. And I think the proclamation does that in a way that the first Confiscation Act hadn't. So that's a big deal, I think.
That's a great answer, but I'm not sure it's in your book.
No, it's in the book. Twice.
Yeah.
I actually repeat myself. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was somewhat puzzled by your opening anecdote based in Kentucky.
They're in Kentucky,
that the
right.
slaves
I get that right.
were free, or the masters said the slaves were free.
Yes.
Kentucky was not in rebellion.
Kentucky was
and
exempted.
would the Emancipation Proclamation have applied?
It did. This is
In
one of
Kentucky?
this is one of those cases where I have a long explanation for this in the book. I didn't have time to do it here, but I think we misunderstand what the exemptions in the proclamation actually mean. In some ways, they're purely technical. All they do is specify which areas are in or not in rebellion. But on the ground, they are actually freeing slaves. And Kentucky, what it produces in Kentucky, because Kentucky is loyal, is in effect a civil war inside the Civil War between Kentucky officials and the Union Army, right? And that goes on right into 1865, right? So what you're seeing on the ground it happens in Maryland as well, it's happening in Missouri. So while technically it's exempted, the fact is that the Union Army is freeing slaves in those areas, and nobody's really stopping them except the state officials are trying to stop it, causing conflict between, you get a lot of sometimes very vicious conflict between Union soldiers from Kentucky fighting Union soldiers from outside of Kentucky who are attacking slavery. So the technicality of the proclamation isn't an adequate description of what's going on the ground. That's one thing. The other thing you need to know about the exemptions in the proclamation is that they do not apply to black recruitment. They only apply to the emancipation, technically, and in practice they don't fully apply to emancipation, but technically they do not apply to black recruitment in the Union Army, and the Union Army immediately begins opening recruitment centers in the loyal border states. Right? Because the Militia Act does not say you have to be free or black or white to be in the Union Army. And they begin recruiting soldiers from those states. So the Emancipation Proclamation, which is where the policy of black recruitment of slaves is announced, applies to the border states.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Yes, first thanks to all this august, wonderful crowd of leaders. I'll say I've been here 7 or 8 years. I'm an amateur. Now I'm a much more advanced amateur than before. It is admirable. Don't ever stop this. Thanks to all. I won't mention any names. Thanks for your presentation. And thanks to these wonderful interpreters up here and their animation and how they're getting to something. About 2 questions, quick, snappy, would get maybe punchy answers, which is, you sparked one and I have another one. Number 1, travel of Lincoln during these tumultuous times before, during the Emancipation. Did he ever have Emerson or Greeley, the eager and the reluctant part of it, travel, or Frederick Douglass? I'm just wondering where that is and what this did to his psyche, going to Baltimore, Vansville, Rossboro Inn, Baltimore, Philadelphia. And the next one, just to combine it, is humor, which was brought out in the Lincoln movie, which he evidently told some, which some of the brilliant people never got quite from the barnyard humor or whatever. But what was that release, maybe during the Emancipation?
During emancipation, well,
Well,
that's a tough
during
one.
the coming up to it.
That's a tough one. I'm not sure how to answer the first question. The closest I can come to answering it is based on my last book, in which in the summer of 1864, Lincoln invites Frederick Douglass to the White House for a second meeting and says, listen, we got to get I may lose this election, we've got to get as many slaves freed as possible before the election is over, before I leave office, because I don't know what's going to happen otherwise. Can you organize a cadre of blacks to travel through the South and try to get it, entice as many slaves as you can off their plantations? That's the only thing I can think of about travel. He has a lot of conversations with Greeley. He has to stroke Greeley a lot, because Greeley needs a lot of stroking. But I don't know. Did he ever have any relation with Emerson?
Emerson did meet with him.
Yeah, he met everybody. Yeah. Other than that, I'm afraid I didn't. A second question, humor. I mean, he had a great sense of humor, but I can't specifically think of any particular instances involving emancipation.
Okay. Thank you so much,
Sure.
sir.
I have the 2 practical questions. Number 1, do you know how many, if any, of the 237 emancipation agents were shot when they went on the plantation?
No. I have, I know, 10 or 15 pages about those people in the book, and it needs somebody to spend several years. It's a gigantic topic that needs its own book.
Okay.
How that happened, how that worked. Okay. I could only note that this is going on.
Yeah. Right.
And the person who knew it, the person I got it from, is John Hope Franklin.
Okay.
He knew it.
Okay, the other question is a logistical question. How does an army travel with tens of thousands of contraband?
Not very easily. It's part with great difficulty. Again, in the book, I explain how one of the reasons, the biggest reason military emancipation can't work is because slavery is just too big. It's just too big. No matter how big the Union Army is, it can't reach all these people. And yet, despite the fact that this is the great paradox of military emancipation, it can only reach a tiny fraction of the slaves, but the number of slaves it does reach is absolutely overwhelming to the Union Army. They cannot handle these numbers that are with them. The contraband camps are filled, they're filthy, the slaves going there, the freed people are dying of smallpox. They simply can't handle it. It's not going to work. And they realize by the end of 1863 that that isn't going to work as a means of getting slavery destroyed. It's too overwhelming a problem.
Good morning. Good morning. It's my understanding that it took till about halfway through the war for Lincoln to give up his idea of gradual emancipation coupled with colonization, and that he was negotiating even in 1862 with Delaware to have a compensated emancipation. And didn't that end fairly late in 1862, those negotiations fall apart?
There are, again, I explain this extensively in the book, but they're going into the war. The Republicans have two different scenarios for a federal attack on slavery. One of them is a peacetime scenario that will apply to any loyal slave states, and that's gradual compensated emancipation with the help of the Union Army. That policy that Lincoln is talking about, he will attempt, and Congress will attempt to, encourage the border states to implement. Military emancipation is immediate and uncompensated, and that begins before Lincoln's first proposal for gradual compensation. So there is no shift from gradual to immediate emancipation. They are two separate policies, one designed to apply to the border states, the other applying to the seceded states. And the gradual policy comes later, and it's there well after the Emancipation Proclamation. He's still offering this to the border states to get them to try to free slaves, when it's not at all clear that either of these policies is going to work. Into late 1863, he's still saying to the border states, look, you can have it gradually, you can do it anyway, just do it, please, because they can't formally, technically apply military emancipation as fully and to a loyal slave state. So they're two separate policies. And the thing that solves it, both policies, the limits of both policies, is the 13th Amendment. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I've been ordered to stand still.
By its terms, the Emancipation Proclamation frees all slaves immediately in the areas and insurgents. Do you think, as a legal matter, the proclamation freed slaves who were never brought within Union lines before the end of the war?
That's the question that everyone's asking. I mean, Lincoln isn't entirely sure whether or not it works.
But do you have an opinion?
Do I have an opinion? No, I don't have an opinion.
Good morning. Two questions.
Sure.
One, Caleb Smith, a member of Lincoln's cabinet, threatened that he would resign if, in fact, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
Did he do it for that reason? Did he resign?
Did he resign for that reason? No, I think
He resigned in January of
Yeah.
1863, but was it because of
No,
him?
I think he did mostly for health reasons.
Okay.
He was one of the most conservative members of the cabinet, but he's kind of a non-entity in that cabinet. So yeah, he resigned, but nobody missed him.
Yeah, only because she mentioned it in her book, Doris Goodwin, but she never indicated why did he ever resign. Secondly, why did Lincoln change vice presidency in the 1864 election?
I think he kind of stayed out of it, right?
He didn't have a choice.
He didn't have a choice.
The convention has
The convention chose. It's again, we're living in a different political universe where they don't always assume the things we're assuming. Yes.
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Morning.
My question, I know what-if questions are a little tough, but if Lincoln does lose the election in 1864, it's been mentioned that, given that he has until March to administer policy and such. And now, with the 13th Amendment, I guess would have still been passed, of course, by that time. How crucial is if Lincoln loses? I mean, if he lost the election, then how do you see it playing out in terms of, I guess, a McClellan victory or whatever?
Well,
in terms of, yeah.
They had a scenario, and I can repeat that one, which strikes me as plausible, that McClellan was a Unionist, and he was going to fight the war to the end, but he was not going to push for a 13th Amendment. So the North would have won the war, but we wouldn't have had a 13th Amendment, and the war would have ended with the Union restored, but with slavery continuing. I think that would have been, it's hard to imagine the mess that would have created. Because, and to some extent, it also, it would depend on what happened to the Congress, really, because technically presidents aren't involved. Lincoln injected himself into the amendment process in a very unusual way, but technically presidents have nothing to do with the amendment. The big deal about those 64 elections isn't simply that Lincoln was reelected, it's that Republicans got 2/3 of the House, which is what they needed to get the amendment through, because the Democrats were absolutely unified. They had a majority. They got every single anti-slavery statute through because they had a majority, but they needed 2/3 for the amendment. And if they got 2/3, then they'd have had to wait till the next Congress, which would have been December of 1865, and who knows by then whether or not the wind would have gone out of the sails for an Emancipation Amendment. It's one of the reasons I think Lincoln pushes for it in January instead of waiting until the next Congress, because he knew he had the votes in the next Congress, and as he says to Congress in December of '64, look, this is going to happen, it might as well happen now rather than later. But I don't see any scenario in which if Lincoln loses and the Republicans don't get 2/3 of the House, I don't see how slavery could have been abolished.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep having to turn.
Yeah, I just want to make the point, which actually I'm writing about, that there is another factor that you're not considering. That's over 2 million men who served in the armies and navies of the Union. And what's been lacking in some of the scholarship has been the advocation of the destruction of slavery and even many aspects of equality by white Northern soldiers based on their military experience and what had gone on. And certainly not just the vote for Lincoln, but the agitation associated with that. And again, as you pointed out, starting with the refusal of Massachusetts soldiers in the face of McClellan's opposition to return slaves to their slave owners.
Right.
So in terms of the scenario the gentleman just asked, it's hard to imagine returning veterans accepting the return to slavery of, first of all, anyone who ever served in the Union Army or Navy, and the freedmen that come in along with that.
When I say it was going to be a mess, that's part of what I mean. It'd be a huge political mess because a clear majority of Northerners by then were absolutely committed to the destruction of slavery. And if they didn't if the majority, we're familiar with this scenario, if the majority can't get its will through Congress, you're in a messy situation.
So I just want to throw that in.
But in that particular case, a particularly dangerous situation because there are tens of thousands of soldiers on the ground, and I mean, another big part of the story that we still don't have and is only alluded to in my book is what's going on the ground in 1865. That's when most of the emancipations take place. Once the Confederate Army dissolves, the single biggest obstacle, the single biggest wall, literally a military wall separating slaves from the Union Army that prevented so many slaves from getting their freedom during the war is gone. And now there's unrestricted access, more or less, between slaves. And all across the South, over the course of 1865, Union soldiers are going on to southern plantations telling slaves they're freed. Slaves who are being held by their masters against are running off and getting to Union lines in a way they could not have in 1865. So the Union Army is still there. It's being rapidly demobilized, but it's there on the ground. forcing emancipation. That's what happens in Texas, right? They don't wait for the 13th Amendment. The Union Army finally gets there and declares the slaves freed.
And of course, the irony of it is that the vast block whose enlistments were not up were African American soldiers.
Yes, that's right. And it's a double whammy, right? Yeah,
Right.
because, what are you going to do with 200,000 black armed soldiers? And the war ends and you say, sorry, your wife's not free. I mean, it's a mess. It really would have been horrible.
Last question, Jeff.
Okay, one last question.
Well, it seems to me that blacks being coming soldiers and doing a really good job was a good argument against slavery, because one of the arguments of slavery was because blacks were inferior, but if they did a really good job as soldiers and could exert authority and everything, they weren't really inferior. I think that would be an argument against slavery.
Well, it certainly disproved the pro-slavery argument, and it's one of the areas where Lincoln does evolve. I mean, it's not that he thinks blacks are inferior, he thinks that slaves are raised in fear and trembling and won't make good soldiers. He's a little worried about that. And there are a lot of genuine anti-slavery people who are worried. They think you're the product of your environment. If you grow up in slavery, you won't make a good soldier. But he very rapidly comes around to the realization that that was a mistake, and he's championing black soldiers like nobody else by the end of the war. Yeah. It's an important shift, I think. Okay, thank you very much.